Okay. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today's topic is on hyperglycemic crisis, and I will try to cover the diabetic ketoacidosis as well as the hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state, which is the new name of hyperosmolar non-ketotic coma. Now we call it HHS rather than HONK. Okay. So there are definitions to understand. Then what are the precipitating factors for these hyperglycemic emergencies? What is the underlying pathogenesis, which is quite interesting and very cumbersome as well. But once you are able to understand that the pathogenesis, you will understand the whole management and where to target the management strategies. What are the various clinical presentations, laboratory findings, and treatment? Diabetic ketoacidosis and hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state, they are also known as the non-ketotic hyperglycemia, are the two most serious acute complications of diabetes. They are part of the spectrum of hyperglycemia, and each represents an extreme in the spectrum of one on the other end. Okay, so there is a significant overlap between DKA and HHS, and has been reported in more than 1/3 of patients. So in the same patient, you can have a DKA as well as HHS. You can find both type of abnormalities. So it is the rule whenever you are called to assess the hyperglycemia in a sick patient, especially check for the presence of DKA as well as HHS. Check the serum osmolality and do the anion gap calculation. That these are two very simple, bedside assessments to proceed further for making a complete diagnosis of diabetic ketoacidosis and HHS. So American Diabetic Association criteria for DKA and HHS, and the table also shows the severity level, that is mild, moderate, and severe DKA, and how to define HHS. So when the plasma glucose is more than 250, we obviously think that uncontrolled hyperglycemia is going on. This implies to the level of DKA in case of hyperglycemic emergencies, but to consider if whether the case is going towards HHS, the sugar levels have to be really high, more than 600 as per the criteria. Arterial pH in DKA has to be low in the acidic range. That is, if it is 7.25 to 7.30, then it is a mild form of acidosis. Below 7.25 to 7 is a moderate form, and less than 7 is the severe DKA. When you have to consider, certain important treatment modalities like giving bicarbonate or maybe dialysis, for example, depending upon other indications. When the pH range is more than 7.3, then it is not acidotic, and then you label that as a rather hyperglycemic hyperosmolar state. Serum bicarb has to be low in case of DKA. So the 15 to 18 range is defining the mild DKA. So 18 to 22 is the normal level of bicarb. You should know the normal range of bicarb, no? Between 18 to 22 is considered as normal. Below 18, that means there is low bicarb and patient may have acidosis. So the level of acidosis is then defined further. From 10 to 15, it is moderate, and below 10, it is severe. And obviously, when it is more than 18 or 18 in the 18 to 22 range, then less likely to be acidosis, rather it is HHS. Urine ketones are obviously positive in DKA, and there can be small positive or in mild range in HHS as well. Serum ketones are positive again in DKA and can be in small quantity detectable in HHS. Effective serum osmolality is variable in DKA and has to be more than 320 in case of HHS. So remember the word hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state. The two terms are defining the condition. It has to be hyperosmolar and it has to be hyperglycemic. So the hyperosmolality is more than 320, which is the effective serum osmolality. Then anion gap, you know how to calculate the anion gap. Okay, the formulas are given below the table here. I hope you can appreciate. The calculated anion gap is sodium plus chloride plus, sodium minus chloride plus bicarb, and you don't need potassium because in some books or in some formulas they also mention potassium, but as per ADA criteria and practicality, so potassium is not required. You mainly need the sodium chloride and bicarb. So this is very easy bedside calculation. When you're called for hyperglycemic assessment, ask the bedside doctor to tell you the electrolytes, and then you can easily calculate the anion gap. If it is more than 10, it is mild. More than 12, it is moderate, and more than 12, again, it is severe. But it can be variable in HHS, so you don't rely on anion gap for the definition of HHS. So the normal anion gap is 10 to 12. Okay, below 10 is normal, but more than 10, you have to consider about acidosis. Then alterations in sensoria or mental obtundation. Obviously, the sensorium is altered in both conditions, and patient can be mild. In mild decay, patient can be just alert. In moderate and severe form, patient can be gradually more drowsy and stuporous and comatose. And in HHS, usually patient is quite sick and very, this is more severe and dangerous hyperglycemic crisis, and patient is definitely found in comatose state. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this effective serum osmolality. This is milliosmol per kg, and the definition, the calculation is given below. If you see here, this is 2 into sodium. Okay, 2 into sodium here over. Yeah, this is 2 into sodium plus glucose divided by 18. And look into the units, milligram per deciliter, not the millimoles. And why is it called effective? Because there is no contribution of urea or blood urea nitrogen. Because urea is semi-permeable across the membranes, is easily permeable, so it cannot contribute to osmolality as effectively. So we omit that and just take glucose and sodium, which have more power on osmolality, which have more effect. That is why it is called effective osmolality. This will guide you best in considering that this is in a hyperosmolar state. Now coming to the precipitating factors. Obviously, infection like pneumonia, UTI, sepsis of any kind, discontinuation or inadequate insulin therapy, patient has stopped taking the insulin treatment. There is poor compliance with the insulin regime, malfunction of continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion devices. For example, if patient is taking using insulin pump, and there is some blockage or stoppage or kinking in the tube or in the infusion set, then that can be the reason. This was usually reported in the past, but now it is not of concern, and people have learned how to manage that. So recent reports does not really impose much risk on this. Compromised water intake, particularly in elderly patients. Patient can develop severe dehydration and land with HHS. So even in this weather, when there's winters, in the winter season, the water intake is decreased very much. Even the normal person does not take as much water as required. And when patient has an underlying diabetes and patient is elderly at risk, they develop UTI and other symptoms because of dehydration, they are at risk of developing this hyperglycemic crisis. Patients with a new onset of type 1 diabetes often present with DKA as their first diagnosis and first common presentation. Then acute major illnesses like myocardial infarction, cerebrovascular accident, or pancreatitis. Poor sick day management. If the patient was a known diabetic on maybe, for example, insulin treatment and has stopped insulin altogether or has not optimized the insulin doses during the sick days when the patient was ill due to fever, dehydration, vomiting, diarrhea, and so on, then patient can develop this DKA or HHS. Patients started on drugs like glucocorticoids, high-dose thiazide diuretics, sympathomimetic agents like dobutamine and terbutaline, and second-generation antipsychotic agents. So always take a good drug history. If the patient has, got admitted with DK or HHS, then maybe these drugs are there which have been recently started and are the reason of deranged blood sugars. Cocaine use, which has been associated with recurrent DKA. Psychological problems, eating disorders, and purposeful insulin omission, young patients with type 1 diabetes, because they have the fear of weight gain. that once they will be put on insulin, they will start gaining weight. So they are young and they have their body image problems and behavioral problems, so they can omit taking these insulin properly. Factors for insulin omission in younger patients like fear of weight gain, fear of hypoglycemia, and the stress of chronic disease. How will they cope up with their peers in school, college, university life? So it has a lot of psychological impact. Now coming to the pathogenesis. Hyperglycemia and ketoacidosis in patients with uncontrolled diabetes is due to the insulin deficiency, which can be absolute or relative. It is more severe in DKA as compared with HHS. Sufficient to minimize ketosis in HHS, but does not control hyperglycemia. So the ketoacidosis is more pronounced in patients with DKA as compared to HHS, because in HHS there is sufficient insulin coming up to combat the ketonemia or ketoacidosis, but obviously the HHS patients are dehydrated and have high osmolality. Glucagon excess, which may result from removal of the normal suppressive effect of insulin. There is no evidence for defective pancreatic alpha cell function in diabetes, since there is a normal glucagon response to non-hypoglycemic stimuli such as arginine. So there is insulin deficiency, but glucagon excess as such can be there, but not necessarily due to pancreatic alpha cell defect. And that can contribute to hyperglycemia. But apparently, it has been researched through this non-hypoglycemic stimuli of arginine that there is a normal glucagon response rather than excess. So it's not because of really the excess of glucagon, but well, it can still contribute. So glucagon excess contributes to the development of DKA, but it is not required. Remember, it is not the main pathophysiology. Main pathophysiology is insulin deficiency. Even if glucagon excess is going on, that is not the reason for hyperglycemia or DKA or HHS in such patients. Increased secretion of catecholamines and cortisol can also again contribute, but they are not required. They are not the basic defect. Basic defect is insulin deficiency, especially in patients with DKA. This is again the flow chart of the pathogenesis of DKA and HHS, and the two extremes are defined here. If you see at the left hand corner, there is an absolute insulin deficiency, and on the other hand, there is relative insulin deficiency. If we start from the absolute insulin deficiency, this leads to lipolysis, increased free fatty acid to the liver, leading to ketogenesis, decreased alkali reserve, ultimately ketoacidosis. On the other hand, there can be a triacylglycerol and hyperlipidemia, but we are not much concerned on that in a patient who has a hyperglycemic crisis. Then on the relative insulin deficiency side, there is no ketogenesis or minimal, if so, present, but that leads to increased glycogenolysis and hyperglycemia, which has its own osmotic effect. Okay, it leads to glucoseuria, leading to osmotic diuresis. Patient can become dehydrated because of loss of water and electrolytes, and then can also develop impaired renal function ultimately. Then again, increase in the counter-regulatory hormones. This is the middle part of the flow chart. That will lead to decreased protein synthesis, increased proteolysis, again, increased gluconeogenic substrates getting available for gluconeogenesis, which leads to increased gluconeogenesis and contribute towards hyperglycemia. So because of the loss of water and electrolyte, there will be hyperosmolality. If it is in extreme form, then that will shift the spectrum towards HHS. And if it is moderate, not much, then and there is more ketoacidosis, then the spectrum will move towards the diabetic ketoacidosis. So I had explained earlier that there can be an overlap between these two conditions in a single patient. Now coming to the importance of glucagon. Discontinuation of insulin in a patient with type 1 diabetes results in a rise in serum glucose, which can be markedly attenuated if glucagon release is prevented by infusing somatostatin. Let me go through the next point, then I will explain. In one report, 4 patients with total pancreatectomy and 6 with type 1 diabetes were fasted after having been maintained on IV insulin for 24 hours. After the withdrawal of insulin, there was a sharp increase in serum glucagon in the patient with type 1 diabetes. Compared with the pancreatectomized patients, these patients had significantly greater increase in blood glucose and blood ketone concentration at 12 hours. So, the importance of glucagon. Obviously, the basic defect is the insulin deficiency, but you cannot, overlook that, or that the glucagon is there, which is exerting its effect because of insulin deficiency. When the insulin is present in the body, it is keeping a check on glucagon. It is keeping it at its level, that this much is required, and the stimulus for glucagon release is also on check through the insulin level. But once the insulin is gone from the body, or patient has become totally pancreatectomized, there is no pancreas, then you can imagine that now the glucagon is taking on the hold. Okay, although the secretion may not be overproduced, glucagon is not hyper secreted, but whatever the level is increased is there, it is gaining power, it is gaining its effect on the metabolism. That is the reason, that is the importance of glucagon here. I hope you got the point. Why the hyperglycemia is low in DKA versus HHS? At least two factors contribute to the lesser degree of hyperglycemia in DKA as compared to HHS. Early symptoms of ketoacidosis, such as shortness of breath and abdominal pain, rather than late symptoms due to hyperosmolality. So, patient with DKA, they develop hyperosmolar features, ketoacidotic features, ketotic breaths, abdominal pain, symptomatology related to hyperketonemia in the body. That's why they come up to medical attention earlier as compared to patients who are not ketotic and have high blood glucose, and they are still not having those features of hyperosmolality in the body, leading to dehydration, stuporous coma, and so on. And then patients, young patients, DKA patients are usually young, and they have GFR that may be as much and very good, above 50%. As a result, they have a greater capacity to excrete the glucose than the usually older patients with the HHS, thereby limiting the degree of hyperglycemia. So the HHS is said to be more common in elderly patients, old age patients. They have compromised renal functions, compromised GFR, so they're not able to excrete the glucose to that extent as required. That's why they develop hyperosmolality, dehydration due to water loss. Whereas patients who are young, they are prone to develop DKA, they have a good GFR, they develop polyuria, excessive diuresis, that helps them to, have a lower sugar levels. So ketone bodies in DKA. These are the three ketone bodies which are produced or developed in DKA, or which are usually studied. One is the acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate, and acetone. Acetone is not really a keto acid; it is a ketone body, and because it is in the acetone form, right? When you have a negative charge on the molecule, then it becomes an acid. So unless beta hydroxybutyrate is specifically ordered, the ketone bodies are estimated by the nitroglyceride reaction in the lab, which measures only acetone and acetoacetic acid. So remember that. And we have more importance of beta hydroxybutyrate because of its slower metabolism and easy detection. More specific detection in case of DKA as compared to acetoacetate and acetone. Acetoacetate is, interconverted with these beta hydroxybutyrate and acetone. Now I will explain this, what is the ketoacidosis. Acetoacetic acid is the initial ketone formed. It may be reduced to beta hydroxybutyric acid, which is an organic acid, or non-enzymatically decarboxylated to acetone, which is chemically neutral. Beta hydroxybutyrate is the predominant ketone, particularly in severe DKA. That's why we want to, measure this acid, beta hydroxybutyric acid, to confirm or to, see that the patient from DKA has come out of the emergency or not. But unfortunately, this is not easily available. Development of ketoacidosis requires a specific alteration in hepatic metabolism so that free fatty acyl coenzyme A can enter the mitochondria, where conversion to ketone occurs. Mitochondrial entry is regulated by the cytosolic enzyme carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, the activity of which varies inversely with malonyl coenzyme A. So these two enzymes, they take on the effect from one on the other. And the balance of these two enzymes directs whether the free fatty acyl coenzyme A will produce more ketones, more keto acids or not. I will explain it in the further slide. Glucagon decreases the production of malonyl coenzyme A, thereby increasing the CPT1 activity and ketogenesis. A concurrent increase in hepatic carnitine content contributes to this process, and insulin does not appear to directly affect the hepatic ketogenesis. So here is the figure which is explaining the previous basically concept. And if you see, the acetyl coenzyme A is entering from this glucose into the mitochondria, okay, into the cell actually. This is the mitochondria, into the cell. And this acetyl coenzyme A is converted into malonyl coenzyme A. And if there is a good amount of insulin available, then malonyl coenzyme A will become palmitate rather than, contributing towards carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1. On the other hand, the free fatty acid that is entering the cell is also converted into acyl coenzyme A, that is inhibiting the acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase. So that's to, stop the conversion of acetyl coenzyme A in malonyl coenzyme A to malonyl coenzyme A. But if there is no insulin, if this insulin is gone, then what will happen? Acyl coenzyme A will again affect the CPT1, and acetyl coenzyme A will, will also convert to malonyl coenzyme A. But the balance goes towards the free fatty acids. These free fatty acids are the one which lead to, activation of CPT1, from where the acyl coenzyme A is converted into acyl coenzyme A through beta oxidation. That is the ketogenetic process going on in the mitochondria. And this beta oxidation will lead to ketone bodies through ketogenesis. This is more cumbersome to understand, but this is how the insulin and glucagon have their roles, right? The stimulatory effect of insulin and the inhibitory effect of glucagon is kept in balance and checked through the dominant effective